Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are, and welcome to Global Perspectives 2024, Truth, Trust, and Technology. My name is Myriam Ciza Gambini, and I'm the manager of the Accelerating Inclusive Power Shift project at the International Civil Society Center. For the benefit of blind and visually impaired people, I am a Black woman with long brown hair and wearing a black shirt. I'm thrilled to present today the session Risk Sharing and Accountability for the Future of the Sector, Beyond Theory, where with a distinguished panel of global civil society and philanthropy experts, we will explore the latest thinking and practice around risk sharing and discuss what are some of the ideas for a transformative approach to risk management and compliance. When discussing power shift and the future of the sector, a key call to action, particularly for international civil society organizations, is to rethink risk management approaches, which are too often unfit for purpose. In a future civil society sector, where partnerships with community-based organizations are paramount, trust plays a crucial role in establishing more equitable partnerships. Traditional risk management approaches are in fact still very organization-oriented and reflecting competitive and individualistic values, operating in a top-down manner where decision-making is concentrated at a higher level of organizations. They also often prioritize financial and operational protection of an organization at the expense of the broader social risks. Consequently, local actors often bear more risk than their international counterparts, and often they're not provided with sufficient resources to manage these risks. And power imbalances play a crucial role also in the lack of adequate support for organizations. Our partner, the Ringo project, developed in 2022 several prototypes to address stuckness in terms of power shift and overall impact and effectiveness within the development and humanitarian world. The International Civil Society Center, together with the Global Fund for Community Foundation, co-hosted the Risk and Compliance Prototype, which was aimed to reimagine the approach to risk and compliance management by testing the value and impact of conversation between important yet underconnected actors of the risk and value chain. We tested this prototype within a project by the Center for Disaster Preparedness in the Philippines, funded by Global Giving and USAID. And we share more about the results of that prototype today. What the discussions led us to propel and desire to change was how can we understand how the sector is still not built on mutual trust, particularly when it comes to relationship with local organizations, but still on needs defined by NGOs or on the donor side. At the center, we also convened a group to discuss work and compliance issues and to create a building block for joint action and commitment, and a space for international civil society organizations, funders, and grassroots organizations to connect, collaborate, and learn from each other. So today we want to build on these conversations to discuss how can organizations, and particularly international civil society organizations, develop partnerships based on trust and solidarity over transaction. We will delve into existing efforts to transform ways of working in a way that promotes power shift and increased mutual transparency and accountability, and also endeavor to understand in the complex political context how we can leverage some opportunities to change the risk and compliance system. So before we start diving into this topic, a few housekeeping notes. The session will be recorded, so you will be able to access the recording in the UVA platform later. Feel free to add any questions that you have in the chat throughout the session. We will also have a Q&A segment at the end of the panel discussion. And if you want to engage with us on social media, you can do so by tweeting about the event at the hashtag Global Perspective 2024. Now I have the pleasure to introduce the moderator for today, Antonia Prentice, Director of Alliance 2015. Antonia is an experienced leader in the humanitarian development and peace-building sectors, having worked with organizations like Oxfam Great Britain Save the Children, and co-founding the Athena Consortium, focusing on gender and the women, peace and security agenda. She currently directs Alliance 2015, a strategic partnership of European humanitarian development organizations aimed at enhancing impact through collaboration. Antonia is also one of the co-creators of the risk and compliance prototype. So I'm thrilled that today she will shepherd us into this conversation. So now, without further ado, over to you, Antonia.
Thank you, dear Myriam, and a warm welcome to you all. It's exciting to see how many people are motivated to show up this morning for this very important conversation about risk management and accountability. So I have the lovely job of moderating a discussion between three highly experienced and extremely interesting and able experts who I'm going to introduce to you right now. We have, first of all, Mike Mercado. He's calling in from the Philippines, and he's the head of Voice and Insights Lab at the Center for Disaster Preparedness, whom, as Myriam just mentioned, was part of this Reimagining INGO's prototype that we were involved with. So a warm welcome to you, Mike. Our second speaker is Phoebe So, who is the co-lead of Phenomenal Funds. So Phoebe is based in Hong Kong, and she's obviously speaking from the philanthropy perspective, while Mike is obviously bringing a local organization, local CSO perspective. Last and very much not least, we're also joined by Jan Bouwman. Jan is representing Oxfam GB today, calling in from Belgium, as am I myself. And he has a lovely job title, Partnership Broker in the Impact Division. So in very CSO style, lovely aspirational job titles for everyone. So a warm welcome to my panelists. I believe that we have a poll being launched by our tech support so that we can see who's in the room with us today. We have done some categorization. You might feel you don't fit into those categories. That's fair enough. We know not all of us do fit into categories, but just to give us a little bit of a sense who's joining us today. And as the poll mentions, if our categorization doesn't fit the way you'd like to describe your professional persona, feel free to drop a message in the chat and tell us what kind of organization or institution you do represent. So what I'm seeing from the poll now is that we've got quite a strong preponderance, rather a long word. What I mean is very many people from the INGO sector, which is interesting. I'm going to take that as a strong message about how interested such organizations are in learning and transforming on this very important agenda, which, as Myriam mentioned, has so much to do with how we understand power and what it means actually to produce results and impacts when we're talking about issues like human rights, the Sustainable Development Goals, or disaster and emergency preparedness and response. We also seem to have quite a few people who feel that they fit in the other category. So I'm hoping they'll take some time to drop a note in the chat so that we can see who you are. But whatever kind of organization you do represent, you're extremely warmly welcome to our discussion today. So thank you very much for this introductory moment. I'm now going to move us on while you have a little look in the chat about the interesting other people who are with us to the discussion itself. We have chosen to start today with Mike from the Philippines. And we'd love to hear a little bit from you Mike, about the experiences you've had at CDP with this Ringo prototype, looking at the kind of constraints that were being faced by community organizations when dealing with funding coming from international donors. And we'd love to know a little bit what the experience was in piloting this innovative risk sharing approach. Whether you feel like you did find some responses and any examples that you might like to share with our audience today about promising practices and building trust with community-based organizations that you think could be replicated, because as you know, we're always looking for replication, knowledge learning, and scale. So please, Mike, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Antonia. Indeed, Center for Disaster Preparedness Foundation was able to test and did a little tweaks in the way that it does its grant making. So in 2022 until last year, we were funded by Global Giving and USAID. And I'd like to mention that USAID in this specific funding was very much accepting of the challenge to really reduce the compliance and requirements that they are imposing upon smaller organizations. So because the fact of the matter is we are actually just funding a maximum of 20,000 US dollars to local organizations. So we were able to fund 32 organizations. And so given that it was fairly a small amount compared to the funding that they usually provide to partners, we were able to cut 52 requirements to just one, which is they just require the organizations and the leaders of those organizations to send the names and check those names and organizations in their lists of at risk or risky organizations. I think it's rather about anti-terrorism list that they have. And so given that, that we were able to sort of engage and convince them to cut those compliance, we were also able to sort of play around the compliance that we ask our partners or grantees, because instead of asking them to send documents and formal reports, those were required too, but primarily what we required them is getting to know sessions. So we interviewed them, we spent a lot of time really pinpointing points of collaboration between CDP and their organization, and really trying to know where we can best help those organizations. So getting to know you sessions as opposed to due diligence was a big part of that compliance. And also we played around monitoring and evaluation, wherein we didn't really want to impose, log frames or indicators that are traditionally being asked of organizations. So as you know, log frames were developed in the 1960s to sort of test or gauge whether capitalism is winning over communism. And this was after the Cold War. So for some reason, it was the standards, right, for organizations doing development work, which was started, of course, by the USAID, and it still continues until today. But with monitoring and evaluation, what we did was we asked these organizations to what actually matters to them. What are the things that they need to measure when doing community-led actions? And some of the things that came up were community participation. To them, what is important is they engage, they consult, decisions come and emanate from the people in the community. And for specific groups like indigenous peoples, for example, what is important to them is that they are preserving the environment where they are inhabiting, where they are present and are living. So those types of contextualization to me is important, to us is important, because ROI focused monitoring and evaluation to us just seems more donor focused and external focused, whereas the things that matter to them are completely forgotten, or even their community assets are forgotten, because the metrics of which we gauge the effectivity of this community-led initiatives are predetermined by external actors. So there's a lot of things that I could discuss about this, but those are the two highlights that I think are important to be brought upon here.
Thank you, Mike. It is true. It seems terrible to compress so much learning into such a short input, but I think you've given us a really strong push towards this idea that, for building trust, you need to have relationships with people. It should be about listening, and a much stronger emphasis on the qualitative than the quantitative. I might just ask you a follow-up question before we hear from Phoebe. And then, of course, we can get into the conversation. But you mentioned a critical factor, which was that, in fact, the international donor, in this case, USAID, was actually quite supportive. Could you just say a few words about how that came about, and what do you think might be the factor that enabled that could be useful for others in other places, because that seems like a very, very critical point of view.
Yes. So actually, first of all, Global Giving has a local staff here. So and Kathy, who is from Global Giving, sort of nudged USAID, and they have obviously office here in Manila, and the staff we were relating to are also Filipinos, and they understand the context. So there was a lot of conversations actually that happened before we come to the agreement that it could be done. But I think the most obvious answer to that is the most important ingredient to this is that they are allowed to do that, given the maximum fund that we were requesting for each organization is just $20,000. So there's a threshold for their compliance, and I think I don't know if it's true for other regions, but in the Philippines, such is the case.
Yeah, super fascinating. Thank you so much for that, Mike. So an interesting point about really keeping it local, about relationships, and about taking the time to talk. I'm thinking that this is the kind of thing that's probably very hard to do in a rush. And it will be interesting also if we can talk later about what we think the possibilities might be when the sums of money get a little bit larger. But anyway,
Yeah.
I'm now going to, with great thanks to you, Mike, and we'll be back to you with questions later on. I'm going to move on now to our second guest, Phoebe, calling in from Phenomenal Funds. So, of course, she has a different perspective because she's working in a philanthropic organization. And I think it's an organization that's very aware of this issue of addressing power balance and trying to find ways of sharing in all sorts of senses. But there may also be challenges and blockages in really trying to mitigate risks more equitably. So we're very interested, Phoebe, to understand how Phenomenal Funds has tried to change grant making practices away from the standard approach. If you've got any lessons to share on that, about these dilemmas and how to share power, in particular with women's funds, because we understand Phenomenal Funds is like a funder of funds that work with women and women-focused and led organizations. And we wonder, of course, what can specifically feminist approaches bring to the table. So Phoebe, if you would turn on your camera, we'd love to hear your first answer to those questions. Thanks.
The issue is I have difficulty to find the button to unmute my video.
Don't worry, we can hear you. So just go ahead, and even though we can't see you, I think people had a chance to see your photo, or they can look at the link info over. So please just go ahead and answer the question, and we will imagine you.
Sure, Thank you. So good morning, good afternoon, and thank you, International Civil Society Center, for giving us this opportunity to share the insights and impacts of our journey. So Phenomenal Funds is actually a feminist funder collaboratives, so that leverage shared governance and flexible, long-term, non-competitive funding to bolster the resilience of women's funds within the Prospera International networks of women's funds. So which includes 47 women's funds, mostly from the Global South and East. So it is a time-bound special initiatives funded by 4 private foundations in 2019, and which will be completed in June next year. So as we approach the sunset, really have a lot to share the insights and impacts of our journey. And speaking of risk management, at Phenomenal Funds, we didn't frame risk like this. Like we focus more on building resilience. So we believe that building resilient women's funds, feminist funds, is essential for sustaining feminist movements. So it necessitates involving beyond traditional risk management to collaborative ecosystem approach, prioritizing more about long-term organizational resilience and movement building over short-term compliances. So we focus a lot on building an environment where collaboration and mutual support, trust are paramount. So women's funds will have the support and resources they need. They know how to effectively mobilize more resources for their communities, and so that they can respond to emergent needs and also seize opportunity to drive meaningful change within that context. So when we navigate the complexity of sharing risk, so it is essential to recognize that this is fundamentally about sharing power. So we believe that true partnerships involves betting on feminist movements with the same conviction and support that these movements offer to their communities. So at Phenomenal Funds, I can found the button now. So at Phenomenal Funds, our approach is so deep rooted in shifting from hierarchical top-down models to fostering a more inclusive and participatory ecosystems. So we actively redefining these norms by implementing shared governance model, where reimagines the traditional dynamics of power in funding relationships. So we have our we ensure that actually our decision, our directions are actually steered by both the funders and the women's funds who receive the funding. So we ensure movement sustainability by shared decision-making, leveraging women's funds expertise for movement relevant solution, and also fostering equal representation in our both steering committee and advisory committee to build lasting partnerships. So, and also throughout our work, our collaboration labs actually further facilitates women's funds to collectively identify the needs of the network, the needs of the movement, the needs of their organization, where they could, with the support, design a more context-specific support mechanism, building more robust collaborative solution to issues that the movement commonly face. So, and secondly, we are really emphasizing flexibility. We adopting multi-year flexible, non-competitive funding through our resilience grants and collaboration grants. So it exemplifies our commitment to responsive support. So it allows women's funds to tailor resource allocation based on their immediate needs and or long-term planning and dynamic opportunities, and also a practice that very important during COVID-19 and also during some crisis, global poly crisis. So our resilience grants from our learning have enabled women's funds to maintain support for grassroots groups during crises like COVID-19 and political upheavals. So that flexibility actually support them in redirect resources swiftly, building emergency reserve for long-term stability, and also providing critical core support for staff care, ensuring that movements leaders avoid burnout. So in our efforts, we also prioritize language justice and address power dynamics by ensuring that all women's funds, no matter how big they are, how small they are, can engage in our process. So respecting and reinforcing their autonomy, not imposing anything on them, but we recognize the value of our partners' contributions. So we will budget compensation and honorarium for women's funds that dedicate their time and resources, their staff, to participate in our process. So that approach actually underlines the way we work, ensuring that our strategies are not only inclusive, but also equitable. So that is the way we focus. When we talk about risk, compliance, we definitely are very serious about compliance and risk management, but we look in a way it's not about pointing finger at them. And rather than as a funders, as a partners, how can we support them riding the waves, supporting them to thrive during crisis. And this is our not only our vision, but also we feel that is also part of our accountability as funders, as members of the movements. So I would like to stop here first. It's more or less as same as Michael, we have a lot to share. We also center a lot around learning and having women's funds to set their own agenda. But I will stop here first so that we can have a conversation flowing.
Thank you so much, Phoebe. Yeah, super fascinating. I think the reframing of language is something that might be really interesting to the participants. Because in fact, when I was preparing today, I looked up risk in a thesaurus and there were about 10 different words. And I would say 9 of them were super negative. They were about, danger and peril. And I think looking from a building resilience perspective is something that's something extremely interesting. Maybe just a quick follow-up question before we come to hear from Jan. I'm interested in you were talking about the very strong focus on inclusivity and trying to strengthen organizations and not just go activity-wise. Maybe you could say a little bit about how the funds come to you. Like, how do you actually get into your network the right interlocutors so that you can actually be supporting women's organizations? And you might say something a little bit about actually language itself, because presumably while we are speaking in English here, I can imagine that many of the conversations you're trying to support are not happening in English. So just a couple of quick points there, please.
All right, so actually this is a really special project. So the 4 private foundation have prior relationship with Prospera International Network of Women's Funds. So and actually before we joined Phenomenal Funds, when they are thinking about this project from the funders' perspective, is that they have been funding feminist movement women's funds for a long time. But sometimes when they actually have to pull out or they have to exist after long-term support, many of these initiatives flop, could not secure the support. So that actually steered them to think what actually they could do to sustain the gains that they actually invested in. So and Prospera International Network of Women's Funds actually provide this idea that actually women's funds play a important roles in supporting the movement on the ground. And we have 47 women's funds here, the network. And in that sense, however, women's funds often, when they have resources, they do regranting rather than looking at their organization building and development. So with that context, actually, this project is still a point. Okay, we recognize the women's funds role in supporting the movement, especially during crisis and during where funding's going in is difficult. They are always there. They are with community. So we need to support the infrastructure, the ecosystem, by investing in women's funds organization development. And this is with that background that phenomenal funds exist. So it's a no-brainer how we find the interlocutors. Perhaps the project is actually co-created by both the funders as well as the network of women's funds.
Thank you, Phoebe. It's really fascinating, and I'm sure many of the people on the call are thinking, "Gosh, wouldn't it be wonderful if more funders and philanthropists had this kind of view about resilience, understanding short and long-term needs, inclusivity, and listening." So, did you want to make one more point before I go to Jan?
Yeah.
Please do.
I want to make one point about the language justice. Yes, we actually all our materials will be translated into French and Spanish, and all our sessions will have 3 languages on parallel. So, but we also recognizing that many of the women's funds are speaking their own language more comfortably. So we are committed to ask the women's funds, you can send your reports in whatever language that we committed to find a translation ourselves. And also, we also want to lessen the burdens of women's funds to write reports. So similar to Michael, we actually focus a lot on conversation, developing the reports based on this iterative conversation, and lessen the burdens of women's funds to write lengthy reports that they might not find meaningful to them.
Great, very, very clear. Yeah, so I think I'm thinking as we talk that, of course, technology and AI may offer even more possibilities for inclusivity, even though we must, of course, always bear in mind the risks there. So, Phoebe, thank you so much for that. I'm going to ask Jan now to turn on his camera, because we've just heard about the need to step away from colonial approaches that were not maybe designed for transformation, and approaches that are too focused on quantitative metrics. So now, as a representative of an INGO or an ICSO, you've obviously been grappling, I'm sure, with frameworks for risk and risk management at Oxfam, maybe for longer than many organizations. And we know that there's been a big effort to try and decenter risk in the way that you're working with partners. Maybe you'd like to tell us a little bit about the journey that you're on in terms of reframing Oxfam's thinking about approaching risk, and see if you have any suggestions from where you are on the journey about how we can take this approach forward, maybe a little faster, and foster something that might look more like collective accountability. So Jan, a warm welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you. So hello, everyone, and it's really great to be here. It's a great opportunity for us to come and speak, but also to learn from others. So what Mike and Phoebe were already talking about, I'm just going to sometimes repeat something, but give it from our angle. Now, for the visually impaired, I'm a Caucasian male. I have blue eyes, I have brown hair and a beard, but quite some gray is coming through. So that kind of tells you that I'm getting older every day. So I won't be able to really do justice to all the work that is going on in Oxfam. But I can talk to you about the journey that I've been on and that we've been on in Oxfam over the past couple of years, and a couple of things that we're doing and trying to change at this particular moment. So when I first joined Oxfam in 2016 as a partnership advisor, I really wondered in the beginnings, like, why do they need a position like mine, right? Because I read the organizational values. I saw the partnership principles that we have. I saw the tools that were very open and adaptable, and you could really, build your partnership as you saw fit. It's all, really partnership focused. And if you put them into practice, you would have really, really good partnerships, equitable partnerships, really. But I found out really quickly that reality was quite different. And I think a major issue there is that we have a project-based partnership model, and it's really common in our sector, I think. So we're not really building partnerships. We're just jointly implementing projects. So we have partnerships for like 15 years, but we have 15 one-year projects. We don't have a strategic kind of relationship with that organization. So the partnership principles, the tools that we have and everything is just, that were meant to really create those kind of strategic partnerships are just morphed into a project risk management approach with a strong focus on our own financial and reputational risks. And two things, really stood out for me and struck me and still strike me is how entrenched that risk approach to partnership is within the organization. It's not mentioned in our partnership documentation, like there is no clear risk approach that we've detailed, but it's just the key, it's just how we do partnership, right? So we have a long list of requirements that we apply to all these different partnerships, but we're not even questioning anymore where they come from. Like it's the highest denominator, right? So we just check all the risks with everybody, then we cover our backs all the time. But is it really necessary? And that question is not really asked. A second point is how many of us, don't seem to be bothered with that schizophrenia, I call it, in our partnership approach, that on the one hand, we talk about our values, our partnership principles, and we talk about long-term relationships, but at the same time, we're basically just treating our partners as subcontractors, very top-down, unequal terms, and basically consider them a risk, to work with rather than an opportunity or, a real partner. But we're on this journey. We're changing and decolonizing our partnerships and decolonizing our approach to risk within that is a big part of it, and it's building on and accelerating work really that is happening with the local humanitarian leadership work, the shifting the power, the feminist principles. So this has all been ongoing, but I think the decolonization agenda really hit the mark, and we're accelerating a lot of work because it's very clear to everybody in the organization, I think, that our current risk management approach are really rooted in that colonial history, and that it really perpetuates these power imbalances and also those beliefs, and the distrust in local partners, in their local knowledge, in local experiences, and things like that. And if we're really serious about localization, about decolonization, about feminist principles, we need to really look at that risk approach in our partnerships. So we're doing quite a few things. On the one hand, you have people like me and our risk team that sit together and have conversations and reconceptualizing our risk and reimagining what it could be, asking ourselves, the different questions about, whose risk are we actually centering when we look at risk? How can we discuss risks openly with our partners, and how do you share risks, effectively and efficiently and equitably within a partnership? Also, how do you enable our partners to actually manage the risks as they see fit, because they live in the context, they see risks from their perspective, and why do we come in with our risks? How can we enable them? How do you give them the resources? How do you give them the power to actually say, but these are the risks that are important to us and to our communities? Duty of care for partners is really important. Is it just a moral kind of duty, or is there a legal aspect to it? And how far do you go? What systems can you set up, to make it happen and to make it stronger? But also, what if we don't decolonize risk and compliance and we don't do this exercise? What is the risk of that? Are we then still relevant? What is our role as an INGO and all this? So I really I speak to our risk department quite often, and I really like how they frame it. And they're saying it's kind of what Phoebe was saying as well. We should look at risk management differently, right? We should stop thinking about it as trying to stop bad things from happening, and shifting it to making good things happen, right? So look at the opportunity. Risk management is a positive thing. It's not just a negative and just trying to, avoid risk. It's about managing them, approaching them proactively, and doing something about it. So we're learning from a few pilots and new approaches. So we have a few flexible funding mechanisms. We do some ICR sharing. We do partnership. We have a partnership investment fund. We have a women's rights fund with flexible, unrestricted and restricted funding, where we really try to push the boundaries, right? So we explicitly work with organizations that do not have the systems in place, the community-based kind of structures. We limit compliance requirements, what Mike and Phoebe were already mentioning. The reporting is different. The initial assessment is not that stringent and things like that. And we allow partners to really decide what they want to invest the money in. And a big part where I'm involved in is CAPAS, and it's a new collaborative and adaptive partnering approach that we're piloting and reviewing at the moment to adopt, which is really going back to our original, partnership approach. It's really about building the partnership. All our partnership conversations are not about risk management. They're not about risk assessment or checking the partner's capacity and if it's trustworthy enough to work with us, but it's really a conversation about the relationship. Who are we? Who are you? And how can we bring, the collective together to actually do something? So it's about co-creation of even the standards and the requirements that you want to put on yourself. And it's based on the context, the purpose, the type of relationship that you have, the type of funding that you have, and the kind of flexibility that allows you. So it's really about building trust, mutual accountability, and sharing risks and benefits equitably. So we're trying that out now to see how that works, and we have some very good learning from our pilots, very positive elements there. So just to finalize, just what I wanted to end up with is like what we want to achieve through these projects and pilots is really three main things, I think. One is create a common understanding and a shared vision across our different departments on what is decolonized partnership, what is decolonized risk management. We work in we have the operation side, we have the program side, and we all come from different perspectives, and we just see this very differently. And we need to find a common kind of ground to work on this. We need to unlearn a lot, our colonial ways of working, our colonial ways of thinking, and then put that into our policies and our practices. And it's about changing mindsets, I guess. A second point is building trust and confidence within our teams and our partners that have now always had somebody tell them how to do things and what to look for and things like that, to really shift the power and tell them, like, you need to decide what is important to you in that particular relationship, and you decide what your assessment is going to be like. You decide what kind of standards you want to put in that are reasonable, linked to donor requirements, linked to the context that you're in, but it's decision goes to the local level and needs to be contextualized. And a third thing that we try to do with all this is create learning and evidence to show that risk management can be done differently or better, if you want to call it that way. And that actually risk management should be part of equitable partnerships and not an obstacle to it. Again, that positive kind of swing to it. But where we are at now, I think it's still a long road. It will take time, and especially resources. It will take investment, because we really need to put our money, where our thinking goes, where our words are. If we really find this important, we need to put our teams and partners in the position to actually do that. So we need to be very deliberate, constantly fight that conditioning of our colonial views, and keep learning and engaging with each other, with you, partners, peers, and donors to jointly make the shift. And I'll stop here, very looking forward to our conversation now.
Great. Thank you, Jan. That was super interesting. So I think we heard from an ICSO perspective about how you can have beautiful plans on paper, but in fact, it's exactly about precisely what you do. And in fact, I'm going to bring Phoebe and Mike back into the conversation now, because I have a couple of follow-up questions that I'd like to ask. One of them particularly, I think, spurred by what the way you described the Oxfam journey. Jan, but something I'd like to hear from all of you on, because we're in a very particular political context and funding landscape now. I mean, I'm evidently going to generalize, so please everybody forgive me, but we've maybe been in a time where it felt like there was growing interest in and sort of funding for the work of civil society, this work that we're doing, that we're discussing here about shifting the power and decolonization. But in fact, what we're seeing in particular with some of the major donors, we could think about the EU and possibly what might be, looks like it could be coming down the pipeline from the US, much less funding for this kind of thing, and maybe some very different attitudes. So I'm just wondering about, like, when we think about donors, because this was the part I heard less from you about, Jan, like how can we influence from our different places the kind of political drivers? I mean, we're not the ones that will perhaps change these, but how can we influence and even try to make an opportunity in terms of what we're talking about here, being effective, having a positive impact? But how can we really work to influence those political actors? I'm thinking particularly about the donors, and I guess particularly institutional ones, because of course we have Phoebe with us, who is maybe representing the kind of donor, as I mentioned, that many organizations would love to be working with. So maybe Jan, do you want to have a first go at that? And then I'll come back to you, Phoebe, and Mike, to see what you think.
Yeah, so that's a very big question, right? And I don't know if I have a full answer for this, but to me, it's really about we're piloting these new ways of working. We're trying them out, we're championing them, and I think really capturing the learning for this, showing the success story, showing the evidence of like, if we do it differently, it's not going to be worse. There's not more risk or more fraud or more financial loss or reputational loss. It's actually getting better, right? So I think we really need to provide that kind of evidence. And I'm thinking about our flexible funding mechanisms, like what an effect does that have? And if we do our partnerships different, what an effect does that have on how we manage risks and how we talk about risks and how in the end it will be better. So it might be an assumption, but we hope that the new approaches that we take actually show that there is not more risk if you invest properly in doing risk management better. And we hope that really showing the positive sides of doing things differently, some myth busting as well on how we look at risk, and just keep challenging that traditional perspective. It's not going to be easy, and some donors and this is a conversation that we have in Oxfam, right? So like, oh, we need to decolonize our ways of working, let's go do it, and the drive is really strong, but we're really mindful of like, oh, but we might lose some donors. It's like, and then some of us would say, yeah, we lose some donors, but you will gain some others, right? And so how do you then influence that in the bigger scale? But it's setting your own priorities, I think, getting your own house in order and really think this is our position on this based on our values and who we are as an organization, and then keep pushing that message forward and learning all together, right? So the LHL agenda, the Grand Bargain, the Chart of Change, Pledge for Change, all these, they all go in that direction, right? So that as a sector, we really need to keep pushing that narrative and providing evidence that it can be done differently. And if we do it differently, it actually has better impacts, better return of investment, as Mike was saying, and just, I won't say less risk or less fraud or things like that, but it won't be worse, and hopefully that message comes across.
Can get across. Great, thanks. So myth busting, tell the story, show the evidence. Phoebe, what would you say in answer to that question? What would you like to add?
I would largely agree with Jan. Actually, all the points that Jan raised, I agree with. Like, actually, from Phenomenal Fund's perspective, we put a lot of resources in cultivating learning, like really learning centered of women's funds needs, right? So, and from our, like, we are going to publish our reports in March. But already from the apparent, from the evidence that we have, is that women's funds really show, like, with flexibility, with participatory approach, in trusting them that they know how and they know when to manage risk, that actually that local knowledge really help them to like facing risk. For instance, Ukrainian women's funds in Ukraine and in East European, they will be able to pivot, providing, like, that's why they invest in care, how to integrate great care in the in their practices, building a healing centers. And then also for them, because we support their organizational development, they can divert their fundings to support the movement and without bureaucratic delays. So these are the concrete evidence that we have to showcase. It shouldn't be an anecdote, that it should be systematically collected and also shared with our grantee partners. Then we build a more stronger voice. Like in here, when we are talking, we are so engineered into competition among each other. I felt it is really exactly during this crisis, we should be more collaborative in shining lights on each other, speaking like collectively about. Actually, we have been using that kind of risk management approach, fear approach, for a long time already. Does it help in protecting the very movements that they funded in facing the political crisis nowadays? It's no, right? So how we have to offer solutions, we have to offer alternative and saying that, no, this doesn't work, this work. So instead of fearing and then trying to make, like, how to say, hard on ourselves in writing a almost impossible proposal in order to attract funding, we have to step back and think about actually what works, what is our responsibility. And secondly, I also feel like working with private foundation program people, in my job, I found that actually you cannot see funders, even institutional funders, private funders, as one block. So we have these special projects because the program directors, program officers in the private foundation do a really hard work in doing internal advocacy, shifting mindsets internally, and it's not easy. They have also a big machines. So how are we going to support them with giving them evidence, supporting them by sharing more honest conversation? There is a lot needs to do to building trust and building relationships, and it's a two-way traffic. So I would like to say, really identified your friendly allies within these institutions, and also continue to have this conversation, providing them with evidence, supporting them with sound narratives, or actually also elicited their views about, like, what funders actually thinking. It will surprise you, and it will give you much more bullets and informations about how to advocate for more flexible solutions. That's
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Phoebe. So I'm hearing, like, to sort of take a real life approach. Maybe we stop encouraging people to write proposals that are to some extent marketing fantasies and actually have something to do with real life. I'm also intrigued by this idea that in fact, people can be just as creative through collaboration and not just in competition, because that feels like an interesting dynamic that maybe marks out the work of civil society from other sectors. But I'd like to hear from you, Mike, about this. Is there something you'd like to build on here about the relationship with funders, or different kinds of funders who, as Phoebe has pointed out to us, are also a diverse and heterogeneous group?
Yeah, maybe from the experience of CDP within the Philippine context of funding, So there is really a dwindling funds being poured into this area region in the global south. But what we're noticing is that they're also reticence in actually localizing. There's also mistrust in local organizations, because the number one argument that we always hear is they just lack capacities. Local capacity don't have capacities. We're tired of hearing that, because what they want actually is just organizations to have the same capacities as INGOs. They want people who write reports, great reports, fabulous reports, but people in the community who are more concerned with issues that they face every day are not concerned about reports. They are concerned about the people that they are working for and working with. So there is really such dynamics that are happening, and we're saying there are community assets that you are sleeping on. There are strengths and people skills that are not valued in the way that we do reports, right? So in the reports, you always see how funding is, the numbers come from external donors, but you don't see the knowledge, the local knowledge, the community participation that happens, which is actually much more important in the change that they want to pursue. So there's narcissism, obviously, in the way that we do funding. And what we're saying is, if, for example, in our partner in Mindanao, we provided them $1 million funding, but they were able to use that funding to access 20 million additional funding from all sorts of stakeholders. So this is what I'm saying is, you shouldn't be narcissists. Like, you should allow people to also look for funding. If we believe that we're saying whole of society approach, we also must say they could, they could get funding or resources from others so that they could actually pursue durable change. And the way we measure change is also quite questionable for me. It's because we just measure through indicators provided by external actors, right? But to us, what's more important is that local organizations learn. There's learning, because how can you change if you don't learn? And so what we're saying is, funding local organizations and facilitating those learnings for them is actually worth funding, worth the resources, and worth the partnership. There's more to be said about private sectors in the Philippines, where external funders actually choose to partner with more private sector because they seem to have the same capacities as them. And civil society organizations are, being ignored, or there's more and less funding that goes to civil society organizations. And this is really an evidence of how there is really sort of hesitance to shift the power or to localize. So that's what I wanted to communicate.
Yeah, that's a really fascinating set of answers. I mean, I think the point you made about like giving money with not too many strings that actually then enables more resources to be generated is really interesting. And I think I'm struck again by the language point, because I feel like the way you've described it is maybe different. If somebody wanted to describe that as, an investment that generated further investments, that would mean something to some people. But what you're talking about is opening up the capacity for more opportunities, but also the point the others have made about organizational resilience. Super fascinating. Now, I have an eye on the time, and I want to just mention to our many participants that you can, of course, put any burning questions you have in the chat. I think our tech support will also launch a little poll where you could put questions. You can also see if you've got a specific question for one of our participants, feel free to put it there. We won't have super long, but I'm sure if there's a question directed to them, they might even be kind to come back to you afterwards. So while you're thinking about the questions, and of course we see there's many interesting questions and reflections already in the chat, I would just come back maybe for some quick responses to our panel before I come to the participants' questions. Because I mean, we've obviously pointed out the fact that you come from different places in the ecosystem yourself. But we'd like to know, I think, a little bit what you think are the critical factors that civil society actors at all levels would need to prioritize kind of right now to lead this, because I think we've talked a lot about, this approach to being transformative in the ecosystem, but I often think that it's difficult for people to know like where to start. So if you could sort of put your finger on, wherever you are in your journey, like what might be the thing that you think civil society organizations at all levels might start with to have an influence on this transformative change, that would be great. And let me just put in parenthesis the fact that I think we're all agreed, and it's come up in the chat as well, that at this point a lot of the power, maybe all the power, is held where the money is. So this requires maybe a tactical approach from civil society, not one that is based on having the most power in the equation. So maybe we might start with you, Phoebe. What would be your critical factors you would advise civil society organizations at different levels to focus on? And then we'll ask Mike and Jan before we come to a couple of questions from the floor. So Phoebe, please.
Oh, I think I have already mentioned, I think that actually providing concrete evidence of what works, offer solutions rather than blaming, rather than playing the victim cards, I would say. If not this approach, then what? That will be an essential point. And I think a civil society organization have to have that confidence in themselves, in the expertise that they have, and being willing, able to share those stories of successes, so story of struggles, and how the local communities actually view risk and handle them. That is important because often so, as Michael mentioned or Jan mentioned, that it seems like the private sector are now claiming the place. Yes, because they know the language. So I think that it is important for us to claim back that language and be confident in our expertise, and show a different personal, different image of civil society, as we are really good at riding the risk and seeding opportunities, and showing that we have the capacity to dealing with that. So yeah, that's my first.
Yeah, I mean, thank you, Phoebe. I really like that because in a way, it's about kind of inside the existing ecosystem, actually slightly building a new one that eventually we hope would become the alternative one. I think there's something very hope-giving about that. Mike, would you like to go next?
Yes, so I'd like to highlight how maybe monitoring and evaluation could really be reimagined, because it's the tool that we use to really assess, manage risk, right? And we see it on papers. But the way we see monitoring and evaluation in the new system that we're trying to birth probably is it should be looking at the changes that are happening as though without any judgment, without any hypothesis of how change could happen, really letting the change or letting the developments, whatever that means for local actors, surface and appreciate them in its own merit, in its own value, and really understanding it from the context, from the subjectivity of people living in that environment. So really, it's just for me more about contextualization and subjectivity, and being very mindful of all these in our engagement with local actors and communities.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think returning to a lot of these human values, because in fact that I guess is what this sector is about in the end. Listening, learning, and I think it's very interesting, this point about actually being honest, like if you were actually honest about what does work and what doesn't, it would be so much more useful for everyone instead of having to hide the fact perhaps that anything ever goes wrong, which inevitably it will. Jan, how would you like to come into this part of the conversation?
Yeah, just looking internally. Really, I think we really need to continue our decolonizing journey and not, oh, it's a trend, we go to something else. We really need to deconstruct our current practices, really analyze where that power sits, why it doesn't work, how it doesn't work. And as Phoebe was saying, what are alternative solutions that actually do work, right? And we really need to push that agenda. And in big organizations like ours, that movement is very slow, and there's this divide between the operations side on one hand that looks at the risks and the reputation and things like that, the programming side that looks at, but our values, and and we have those conversations, and we really need to sit down around the table. We're doing that, but like really go through with it. So what does it actually mean in practice? Like, where can we come together and find a way that works for the whole of the organization, right? And bringing those perspectives together. And a second point, I think, and linked to that, is really supporting champions in our organization, because there's a lot of good stuff happening in Oxfam. People just doing something differently, writing a different project, or having a different idea. And even in the sector, right? So, to take it outside of Oxfam, there's so many good things happening, right? So it's that sharing, that learning, and really supporting and enabling people to do that, like take those risks, fail, but learn, and then tell us your story and see how we can bring that. And I think we need to keep focusing on that, just not let it go. Because, how quickly we move on to the next thing. And I think this one is a really important one, because it just means making it right. And then adding a last point to it, it's about resources, right? Because we have this beautiful idea of doing the partnerships in a different way, but we already said that we're going to do that in 2012, right? But never managed to actually do it, because we have this project-based approach, and we have very few resources in Oxfam and in partners to actually do the real partnership work, because it's all program and project based. So how do you break that? So that means that we should put our funding, there where we think it's going to make a difference. So how do we use our flexible funding, our unrestricted funding, to actually support countries and partners to set up the relationships that we want, and the risk management involved in that?
Great. Thank you very much, Jan. And I think it's good for us all to hear, we should have the courage of our convictions, even if it feels like some tides are going against us in civil society. In fact, this is the moment both to stand up and stand together. So I've got some interesting questions coming in on the chat. We won't have time, unfortunately, for very many, but I will start with one for you all to consider. Which is, do we have evidence that the difference in relationships between INGOs or ICSOs and local CSOs in terms of trust and genuine partnership is tracked in terms of downstream changes in the ways that local communities are also considered and treated? So, I think that's a little bit like, it sounds really nice if you can do this, but do we actually see transformative changes, as it were, on the ground? Who would like to pick that up first? Maybe, Mike, do you want to come in on that one first?
What I know, and this is from conversations with people's organizations and community-based organizations, at least with the organizations that we work with, they really don't trust. I'm really sorry to say, they don't trust INGOs, because for one, they credit grab. They take every work that they have and wave it as if it were their own. That's one. And second, much of the resources are actually, from their perspective, hoarded by the INGOs. And I think these practices, they're talking about practice maybe from years ago, I'm not sure, but those things were brought to our attention when we were talking about how they are not working primarily with INGOs. They just choose to be volunteer-based because that's how they remain, their values.
Yeah, interesting point. Credit grabbing. Let's stop that. But I think, I mean, it's important to be honest about it. Like, you need to start from a basis of trust that's got to be built first. Jan, do you have a comment on that point about the trust and
So-
what actually happens at community level?
Yeah, so I did for me, the question reflects again that mistrust, right? So it's how, okay, so we are decolonizing OGB in the UK. How does that trickle down to our Nepal country team? Are they doing what our policy actually saying, or are they not doing it? And there's that lack of trust. Ooh, so what kind of controls do we need to put in place to make sure that they follow the policies and things like that? And then it goes down to the communities, right? Oh, but now we are doing, this transformative way of working with our partner. Are they actually doing it with the communities, and how does that reflect? And I think it's a really valid question. I'm not saying, and it's a real issue. There's a lot of local organizations that are like INGOs, just looking for the funding and trying to do, and like the work on the ground might not be as like important to them as we all hope it to be. But it is about that trust building, right? And what Mike was saying, that the trust deficit goes both ways, is just there. So how do you break that cycle, right? How do you make sure that you have those conversations openly, with your partners, but then also with the communities, right? And does that mean that Oxfam need to sit in that conversation between partners and communities? Hopefully not, but like, how can you create a conversation where you put funders like Phoebe and an INGO and the local community and the local partner who represents them all together in certain spaces? How do you share learning, and how do you have a conversation all together to kind of build that trust and move it forward? But, yeah.
Yeah, nice. And this there's a few questions in the chat actually here about like spaces for how do you create spaces where these happen? But I just like to come to Phoebe so she has a chance to answer that question, and we'll see if we can sneak in one more before the end. Phoebe.
Oh, actually, I want to provide an example when we worked with, it's not INGO, is a more regional international women's funds. And we support collaboration grants, and the network, Urgent Funds network, actually choose together the sister funds all together to think about how to build the care infrastructure. What they mean is, how do they build care for their staff, and as well as how to build care within the grant making practices that they have. What they actually did is really invite practitioners, invite human rights defenders, women's human rights defenders in the sharing, and really want to hear from them what actually care means to them. And also how like they reflect on themselves, how to build in that resources within their own grant making practices. So I think that could be one showcase. Trust can be built if where we start, right? We starting from a point of valuing our partners as very important, who have a lot of knowledge, that we want to work together with them. Then you will follow that way of like starting to building trust. But at the same time, I also have to acknowledge that actually trust building, it needs a lot of time and resources, human resources especially. So if you, within the organization, one program officers are actually pressure to finish the project by certain time frame, you have multiple projects and you have indicators on above you to fulfill. Do you do that? How much agency and how much time and resources that person can think more deeply, how I can do a little bit more to change, right? What Jan mentioned before, right? really have to champion really have to champion people who take an extra steps to think further to do. And I believe that it provides hope if every one of us think one steps, just think one steps, that we could actually opening up more space for our partners, opening them up more, like having a dialogue rather than checking the box. Maybe we all have our agency and our realm of power. So how we consciously, it's not about just leveling all the power, but more shifting the mindset of I have the power, but how I consciously use that to lift up others. And to, from my, I worked in Amnesty before, and I worked in, actually, I worked in a relief and capacity building grants, setting up for the East Asia funds. Every day I have to think about how to translate that urgency, how to build that stories to convince internally that, oh, this is the relief that we have to give, right? And also have that compassion about, right, the situation that I'm sitting in our office, but the activists actually facing this risk every day. So it's not about blaming yourself, but maybe recognize that we have our own privilege and recognizing we have our own power. Although the system might not be perfect, I might be also trapped in that system of performing, but we still have something that we can open up, and that's trust begin. And don't be this, how to say, like, be hopeful. Yeah, we have more than we thought. That's what I would like to offer in this conversation.
Wow, thank you, Phoebe. And I can see from the chat, people are really, really appreciating this. I mean, I wanted to highlight the fact that you mentioned listening in, investing on, and centering the question of care. I mean, it's a massively important thing, obviously, not just in feminism, but feminism really brings it forward. And it's something that's still completely under discussed, I think, in this whole area. I'm very struck as well by the constant focus on time sharing, relationship building, and stepping away from the project methodology. So we have a long way to go, obviously, to fix this transformation. Now, we don't really have time for an answer to all of the questions, but I'm going to just highlight the themes that have come up in the questions, and then you can each have a minute to say whatever you would like to say. You can say something about the themes or just the burning thing that you wanted to finish off the session with, because it's been incredibly rich and you've shared so much. So the things that have come up in the chat are particularly about power, like the question about how can you actually make safe spaces where people who have less power can talk honestly with those that have more. I think the questioner wanted to know, does anyone have experience of actually building those spaces? Also, a few have come up about the shrinking of civic space, that really we've got people working in civil society and defending rights under threat as never before. I think the questioner is asking, how can these kinds of things that you are working on and sharing about help in such an environment? So those are maybe and I'm sorry to the questioners, I hope it wasn't too a naive summary of the complex and interesting questions that you raised, but I'm just going to give you each a minute just for your closing remark before we wrap this incredibly rich session up. So we might start with you, Jan, then Phoebe, and we'll finish with Mike.
Sure. Yeah, I just want to talk about the safe spaces, I think, and how do you have that conversation in a position of power? And so in this capas, in this new way that we want to engage in partnerships, we don't talk about the templates, because the template doesn't matter. We don't talk about, what the questions in it, and the whole idea is it's how you show up in that relationship. Be aware of the power that you bring, be aware of the power that somebody else has, openly discuss that, and really step into that space with humbleness and openness to really listen to what others have to say. And I was like, oh, I'm Oxfam, I'm an expert, I'm doing this, you don't have capacity, so we're going to do it this way, and this is your capacity strengthening plan. It's like, no, just listen first. Like, how are we as a partnership collectively going to keep people safe? for instance? That's the real question. And what you then already have, we can build on. And what we then have, we bring it together and we see in a combination of this, how we do that. So it's really about what Phoebe was saying so powerfully, being aware of that power, stepping into that space, and not with, we need to do this quickly, we need to tick a box, we need to get this project up and running. But really, we're here to define together how we are going to do things, how we are going to work together. And if you don't step into it like that, then you can have the most beautiful templates, you can have the most perfect risk approach document and practice and whatever. It's not going to work. It's really up to the people stepping into those spaces to create that safe space together with the partners. And it's not easy. It's a very difficult job. And that's why maybe we need, to build those kind of skills, not only in Oxfam, but in our partners as well. And those are things that come out of our piloting this new approach constantly. It's like, we really like this, but it's really, really hard to do because we're not used to it, right? So just try it out, do it together, create that safe space together, I would say.
Yeah, wonderful. And I would say that's where we see, in fact, the wonderful limit of AI. I suspect only human beings can learn these sorts of skills and behaviors. This is really something, another article of hope. Phoebe, what's your takeaway minute?
I think trust starts from willing to be vulnerable. Trust also starts from being transparent. And I remember in advisory, a facility advisory committee where the funding program officers and also Women's Fund sitting together to review the proposal together. And you were surprised at how much, if you have that container, being brave enough to step a step further, and you were surprised at how much that the other party were willing to share. It's more about, if you are being vulnerable, you are feeling comfortable to be more transparent about your practice, why you are doing that, why you're asking that questions, and be curious about the other party, right? Rather than imposing a standard, but ask, what do you think? And listening. That is a powerful container. That is a powerful skills to build trust within the space. So, but you have to take the first step. It's scary, but it's worthwhile, I would say.
Wonderful. Thank you, Phoebe. I feel there's many people listening who are wishing that you were a psychotherapist as well as a feminist philanthropist, because these are wise and wonderful words. Be brave, be vulnerable, be curious, be real. Mike, you have the floor for your final minute before we wrap up.
Yeah, so I'd like very much what Jan and Phoebe had already mentioned. So if we have many more white men and women acknowledging of their privileges, it will be much better. But jokes aside, I think that what we are all talking about is just really humanizing again all our processes, right? Like having open space technology where language should not be a barrier, letting others communicate in a way that is comfortable for them. And that might take a lot of resources, or it could be in a different form or whatever, but having that open space technology where everyone could actually talk about things that they want to talk about, as opposed to having this agenda, set by a certain group who holds the power. And I like very much what Phoebe said about vulnerability, because that, to us, in our experience in the Shift to Power global movement, is when you feel that you could be vulnerable with people, that means you trust these people. And so that, to me, is very powerful. And I'd like to end with that, just letting people to be vulnerable and provide that space so that they could talk more about these vulnerabilities and work together so that they could create beautiful things together.
Thank you so much, Mike. Indeed, creating beautiful things together. What a great way to end. I will simply wrap up now by thanking extraordinarily much our panelists, Jan, Phoebe, and Mike. We talked about the need to check our privilege. I have many, but today I think my privilege was to be able to moderate a really, really practitioner-based, open and passionate conversation. So thank you to you all and the International Civil Society Centre for hosting. Myriam.
Thank you, Antonia. Thanks for guiding us in this conversation today. And I really also want to thank our brilliant panelists for your thoughtful contributions and really thought-provoking discussions. I think there is a lot to take on and reflect on in regards to our work. I would also like to thank the audience for joining us today and also for making this session engaging with your questions and your comments in the chat. So please do continue engaging with the work of the center. I'll share more about that in a minute. But just reflecting also on the work that we do in terms of supporting organizations in raising the ambitions. I think that in terms of the call to actions that we've heard today from our speakers, regarding the need for co-creation and also looking at risk management as opportunity can really help us in terms of prioritizing appropriate power shifting and also making sure that we do prioritize the valuable diversity and local expertise that is not part of the so-called international norms, and that we can ensure that our partnerships with local organizations are rooted in supporting their strategic engagement and not just the activity driven, as has been the case, unfortunately, so far, so that we can really engage in thinking about a different future for international civil society organizations and for the larger sector. So if you want to continue being engaged with the work of the center in this regard, please do reach out to me and I'll share more about the work that we do in terms of supporting also donor organization on power shift and localization and working with other actors. So starting at 12:30 Central European Time, we now have our next session, Mental Health in the Digital Age. Our civil society organization using technology to advocate for mental well-being. And following that, we will have 3 more sessions today, so please do check the agenda and make sure to tune in for those. Once again, thank you all for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you again in the International Civil Society Center online and offline gatherings. Thank you all. Bye.
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 Thanks. Bye-bye.
Do we have to leave? Bye-bye.
We're all leaving, right? Or
Yes.
do we need to stick around? No, huh?
Feel free to leave. Thank
Okay.
you.
Take care.
Thank
Thanks so
you,
much, Myriam,
joining.
for the
Great
opportunity.
session.
Yes,
Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Thanks, Myriam. I'm going to end the call now. Great session.